Welcome to SWK 899, the MSW Capstone course. This is Dr. Yvonne Ruiz. This screencast will review the required student-written in-depth case analysis format that you will use for the decision case method. So, to begin this screencast, I want to suggest that when you're writing up your in-depth case analysis, that you use an executive summary approach. So the written case analysis is not meant to be a summary or a description of the case. It's not meant to be long and involved and exhaustive, but rather an executive summary is designed to help decision makers who need an understanding of and advice for dealing with a problematic situation. So you're going to be very focused in writing up your in-depth case analysis. You're going to provide a concise analysis. You're going to include the supporting evidence for your problem identification and each required section of the format, including and up to the recommendation. So the executive summary format is not intended to be a description or a summary. I'm going to repeat that again. It's not intended to be a description or a summary, but it's meant to be concise, relevant, focused, and written in an analytical and critical thinking style. You do not need to review all the details of the case, and you do not need to review all of the events that happen in the case. Rather, you are using the information and the content that's supporting the problem identification that you are analyzing. So think about your case analysis ranging from 5 to 8 pages. It should be no more than 8 pages. Your paper should be written as a narrative. Your paper should be written to flow and to be logical, should be well written, and each required section of the format is to be the section header. So it should flow easily and concisely, clearly, and logically. So the in-depth case analysis format is comprised of 9 sections. The introduction, the problem statement, the contextual analysis of internal and external issues, the alternative solutions and practice approaches, the application of research and evaluation skills, connecting case to cause, diversity, equity, and inclusion, recommendation, and finally, the rationale. Each of these 9 sections is the section header. All of this information is to be included in a separate section. It is to be written as a narrative where each section flows into the next section. Now let's review each section individually. Number 1 is the introduction. So keep your introduction brief. Introduce the major elements comprised of who, where, and what of the case. You do not need to describe it. You just need to introduce the elements that you're going to review in your case analysis. The brief introduction should be 1, maybe 2 paragraphs of approximately 2 to 4 sentences each paragraph. Now, that's a guideline. It might be a little bit more. It could even be less. It depends on how you're writing up your case analysis. But the introduction should not be longer than maybe half a page, because you're going to elaborate in the following sections. The second section is the problem statement. This is where you give a specific and concisely written formulation of the problem. Now, let me just say, there might be several problems that you can identify in the case. However, for the case analysis paper, you are going to choose one problem, the one that you think is most relevant. And this specific problem is going to guide your analysis and the problem solving and all of the other content in the following sections. So you're going to clearly state the major problem from your perspective, and this should be 2, maybe 3 sentences. The third section is the contextual analysis. This is where you're going to summarize the internal and external issues that have created or sustained the problem. For example, why is the problem occurring? Depending on the system level, whether you're choosing micro, meso, or macro, these internal and external issues may include cultural, economic, resources, political, legal, organizational, and or social levels. Issues may also include ethical issues, interpersonal relationships, and intrapsychic and biological conditions. So this is where you're going to provide a snapshot or a picture of the context. What's going on here? What are the important factors that we need to take into account? What are the issues that are related, directly related to the problem that you've identified? Think of person and environment. Think of biopsychosocial, cultural, spiritual factors. Think of social context. All of this is what you're going to draw from in order to write your contextual analysis. This also may be a section where you use and cite professional sources and references. Of course, you're going to be using APA style both for in-text references as well as for your reference page. Each case includes 2 or 3 additional readings, and these readings are what you can draw upon for your professional sources and references, as well as any other references or sources you might want to use from other books, other journal articles, or other online sources. So the fourth section is alternative solutions and practice approaches. There are 3 parts to this section. Part A is where you're going to identify 3 or more possible solutions to the problem. So 3 or more means that these solutions need to be plausible. In other words, you can really implement these solutions. Each solution needs to be distinct and non-contingent, which means that it can stand alone. It's not dependent on another strategy or solution that you've identified. Part B is for each possible solution, you're going to identify the advantages and disadvantages of each solution that addresses the problem. In other words, you're going to think through each possible solution What's the good that can come from it? What are any negatives, or what might be unintended consequences? So you need to think of both sides of implementing your solution. Part C is where you include a practice approach for each strategy. And I'm going to repeat what I said before, that each practice approach needs to be plausible, it needs to be distinct, and it should not be interdependent on a previous practice approach. So you can think of what type of intervention you might use, or what type of practice theory you might apply, or if there's a specific model or intervention. So part 5 is the application of research and evaluation skills. So this is the first of 2 slides on section 5, and this is an introduction to the actual content that's required in this section. So before you write this section, take a few minutes or take some time to plan and ask yourself, what is the most appropriate research or evaluation approach to study the specific problem that you've identified? Keep in mind that research and evaluation are 2 separate lines of inquiry. They're 2 separate approaches. Both can be useful in problem solving. So for example, you might consider evaluating the implementation of your practice intervention, or your practice approach, or your practice model. How are you going to evaluate whether the intervention was successful? Number 2 for consideration, you might research the effectiveness of your intervention through process or through some other type of outcome measurement. You might use a qualitative approach where you look at what do the case collaterals, what do they say? You can use an interview, a focus group, or some other type of ethnography, for example, to collect some data on this. You might do a needs assessment. So you might use program evaluation. You might use standardized tools to do your evaluation. So there's lots of ways you can approach this. The idea is that you draw upon the material that you learned in social work research and program evaluation to complete this section. Don't forget to cite your professional sources and references. For example, maybe your research textbook might be helpful. Now let's look at the next slide that actually presents the required content. So this is the actual content that you're going to document in Section 5, Application of Research and Evaluation Skills. A, you're going to identify your guiding study aims, the research design, the justification of your sampling approach. So, for example, who are you going to use in order to gather your data? How will you optimize rigor and promote trustworthiness in your data, especially if you're using a qualitative line of inquiry? How are you going to operationalize your approach? How are you going to measure it, especially if it's a quantitative approach? And discuss threats to validity if you use a quantitative approach. So basically, what are your goals? What are the aims of your study? Then you're going to go into B. which research approach would you use? So you need to decide, for example, are you going to use a goal attainment scaling? Are you going to use single subject design? Are you going to use some other type of practice evaluation method or some other type of research or evaluation approach? And again, you can think about the case, but the contents in this section needs to be directly related to your problem. So there may be lots that you might want to research in the case, but it needs to be relevant to the problem you've identified. You can think about the contextual factors, the internal and external issues, as maybe you want to collect some data on those. So you need to make sure that everything in your analysis is connected to each other and builds. So then you're going to move into section C, number C for section 5. You're going to identify specific process or outcome measures that are consistent with the treatment or intervention goals that you've identified. If you use a standardized measurement, include the citation. If you're going to do, for example, a needs assessment, you might want to include some sample questions that you would want to include in your instrument. Or if you're going to do an interview or a focus group, include a sample of what types of questions you might include. And then finally, D, what are the strengths and limitations of your research evaluation plan? So moving on to section 6, which is connecting case to cause. And this is about applying policy practice to the case. So you're going to draw upon the materials from policy. It might be a historical perspective, maybe drawing on material from SWK 703, or material from your more advanced policy courses. Again, you're going to cite professional sources. You might use some of the textbooks that you use, or journal articles, or again, online sources. But what you want to do is identify a relevant policy. It doesn't have to be more than one policy, but there might be, more than one you want to cite that are relevant to your case analysis. You want to be specific. You want to connect the policy to events in the case. It may be a legal policy. It may be an agency policy. It might be a social work type policy, but you want to have the policy be important to the outcome of the case, or influential in some way to the outcome of the case. So, for example, social determinants of health may be applicable. It may be a specific policy. It may be some law. It may be a city or state law, maybe educational law, maybe the Americans Disabilities Act that might be relevant. So there's a lot that you can draw from in this section. Remember to be as specific as possible. So number 7 is diversity, equity, and inclusion section. And this is where definitely, as social workers, we're constantly reaffirming our commitment to social justice, economic justice, racial justice. So in this section, you're to analyze the case through the lens of a social justice theory. So you need to use theory in this case, and social justice theories are about making structural changes that acknowledge and notice that not all things are equal or equitable or just. So examples of social justice theories that were reviewed in diversity course, in human diversity, or in human behavior, or in any of the other advanced courses you took. Some of these examples are feminist theory, critical race theory, intersectionality, liberation health theory, economic redistribution, oppression theory, empowerment, and strengths perspective. So you're expected to apply the theory to specific aspects of the case. Again, this might be connected to the contextual factors. It might be connected to the problem that you identify, or the practice strategies and practice options. But you need to have this be relevant and to flow in the context of the whole case analysis. So think of the dimensions of human diversity: race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, ability status, language, immigration, so on and so on. All of these are relevant to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So section 8 is the recommendation section. This is where you identify and justify your preferred strategy. You may hear some snoring on this screencast. That's my dog Lily. She's a bulldog. You may know that bulldogs tend to snore because they have very short snouts. So, yeah, please excuse her snoring. So just to repeat, so the number 8 is the recommendation section. You're going to identify and justify your preferred strategy. So you're going to choose one of the strategy options. You're going to explain why you selected that particular strategy. Why is it the best strategy to resolve the dilemma or to approach the problem in the case? And say something about how you'll determine its effectiveness. How will you know that your strategy is the best solution? So be sure that your recommended strategy can be plausibly supported by the resources that are available in the case context. This is an important point. You may have a solution, but if the resources aren't available, it may not be the best solution, right? So you may decide, well, we'll bring in external consultants. But if you know that the agency or the setting is running on a shoestring and there's not enough budget, and that's one of the problems of the case, then that may not be the best solution. And finally, section 9 is your rationale. And it's your rationale about everything that you've written. So you're going to be reflective, and you're going to identify and think about, what sources have I used that have guided my analysis and critical thinking about this case? So, for example, did you base it on your experience in field education, or your experience in a previous agency, or with a previous client? Did you use your intuition? Did you use specific theories or personal values to guide your analysis? Was there some other authority, such as a previous supervisor, who was helpful in thinking about what's happening in this case? Did you do any external research? If you did, provide citations. And previous discussion of similar problems, or it could be something else that's unique to you. But think about, what is it that guided your thinking? How did you put your ideas together? How did you make sense of this case? That's your rationale. It's not about a rationale for your specific recommendation, because you've already justified your recommendation. This is about how you put all of it together, all of the required 9 sections. And that's the whole in-depth case analysis format. So, as the writer of the in-depth case analysis format, it's also expected that you'll take a leading role as a facilitator in the classroom discussions. Since you have really thought deeply about this case and read it, probably at least twice or three times, you're going to be much more familiar with details of the case as well as the multiple perspectives that you considered as you were writing up your case analysis. So part of your grade is also includes the presentation in class and how you present your thinking to the class and guide questions and comments and perspectives for discussion. So after the class, the other part of the assignment that you are required to do is to include a post-analysis summary and reflection paper. So this paper is due the following week when the case was discussed in class. It's, a couple of pages. You can do 3 pages if you want. But this is where you briefly summarize your analysis and your decision. That really should be, 1, maybe 2 paragraphs. Again, you don't have to use description. It's really about summarizing what did you write about? What were the important points that you pulled out? And then you're going to discuss the impact of the class feedback, both from the specific feedback paper that responded to your in-depth case analysis, as well as the class-based discussion. And so you're going to think about the impact of other perspectives, other comments, other students' thinking, and the impact on your own thinking and the decisions that you made about the problem identification, strategy options, research, policy, context, and so forth. So what would you change about your assessment? Would you still make the same decision? Why or why not? And then what is your rationale? I would include here too what was helpful about the class discussion, what was helpful about the feedback paper. How did it help you to think in a different way? And then finally, you're going to integrate content related to identity, diversity, equity, social justice, and the influence of intersectionality. Again, drawing on the class discussion and the feedback. How was your thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion enlarged? How did your thinking deepen? Again, why or why not? And what's your rationale on that? So this comes to the end of this screencast. We talked about the in-depth case analysis format, each section and the required content, and then the post-analysis summary and reflection paper that's due the week after you present your case. Thank you for listening this far.